Amoa and his wife had watched their little son Noah, 2-year-old Noah, die from malaria, just like that within 24 hours. This little boy and his parents had been there ministering, being missionaries in the village of Sumakarima. They had bravely stood when Bushmen had threatened to kill them because they were causing new changes to happen in the area. They had stood on the promises of God, and God had protected them then from death, but now it seemed that God had not protected Noah. Noah had died, and there was nothing that anyone could do about this. And in the morning after his death, they had put him in a little box, and they had dug a hole, and they lowered him in. They had said a prayer. They had sung a song that was hard to sing about standing on the promises when God's promises had seemed to let them down. And when little Noah wasn't standing, he was lying down dead in a box down in the ground, waiting for the dirt to go back in and cover him. But as they began to move the dirt in to the hole, 1, 2, on the third movement of dirt, something happened in that hole. The villagers ran into the jungle when that happened. Amoa dropped to his knees in shock when that happened, because what happened was, from inside the box there came a sound. Now the only thing inside that box was the body of Noah, who had been dead at least 18 hours by now. And Amoa stopped putting any dirt in, and he looked down to the box, and he asked a question, which if you think about it, is kind of silly either way. Noah, is that you? I mean, who else would it be? But how could it be? And he listened, and coming up from inside the box, he heard the voice of little Noah. Yes, Daddy, I want to get up now. What do you think Amoa did? He jumped in that hole, he grabbed the box, lifted it up, put it out. He ripped the top of that box off, and there was Noah, and he sat up. His color was back to normal. He had been completely pale and cold. He had no pulse when he had been put in that box. He was not breathing. He was obviously dead and had been dead for hours and hours. And now he sat up looking just fine. Noah, another silly question. You're alive? Well, yeah, right? I mean, what if he says no? Yes, Daddy, I'm alive. I'm hungry. Okay, let's feed this boy. He grabbed him and ran back through the jungle to the hut, gave him something to eat with his wife there, with just the two of them just hugging him and looking at him. And after Noah had had a chance to eat something, Amoa asked the next question, and this was a question that everybody wanted to know the answer to. Noah, who woke you up? You were dead. Who woke you up? Noah looked up at his daddy. Oh, I saw Pastor Haru Hariva. He came to me and said, get up. Your mommy and daddy are doing God's work. You do not need to go to sleep yet. And so I woke up. What a miracle. And then, to make sure that God's name would receive the glory, Amoa took Noah by the hand, and he went out of the hut and began to walk through the entire village. Now the entire village knew Noah was dead. They had all been there, seen his lifeless body brought out from the hut early that morning. They had seen him nailed in the box. They had seen that box sit there next to the hole as they had worked digging it for hours and hours and hours. And they had seen it put in. And now they all saw him walking around looking perfectly fine. And their eyes got huge. And then the ones who had been really enjoying the lotu, the worship times, and the stories about Jesus, they began putting their hands in the air and saying, Big Master on top is true. Big Master on top is true. That was the name they had for God. They called him the Big Master on top, up in heaven. And they said, Big Master on top is true. And Amoa has the power to raise the dead. And Amoa, he agreed with the first part, but he did not agree with the second part. He said, no. This is not my power. Only Jesus has the power to raise the dead. This was not me. And I'll tell you, the word of what happened spread up and down the Tarama River. And many more people wanted to hear the stories of the 7 days, the stories of Jesus, to have missionaries come and tell them about this Jesus who could not only raise the dead, the really physically dead, but could also raise people from being dead while they were alive. What does that mean? People who were living lives that were just sad lives, lives that were trapped in spiritualism and devil worship and revenge with the puri puri. Jesus could give them new life. Jesus gave someone else new life as he was trying to spread the story of Jesus around, and that was Elwyn Martin. This was the closest that Elwyn Martin ever came to dying. Elwyn Martin now had been there in Papua New Guinea for many years, and there had been such a spread of the 7 days that now guess what they had every year? It's something you guys have every year. Say it again. Camp meeting. Papua New Guinea had an annual camp meeting, and people would travel from all around that huge island to come to the 7 days camp meeting. They held it in a big town called Wabag. And everybody would travel there. People would hike for days to get there, carrying their belongings on their back. People who had the ability to get on the jeeps and come through mountain trails would come. And people who could travel by plane, not very many, but there were jungle planes. There were small bush pilot planes that would take off and land at these little airstrips throughout Papua New Guinea. And so if you had the ability to travel on one of those, that's how you would get to camp meeting. And that's how Pastor Elwyn was going to go to camp meeting that year. He and 2 other pastors had arranged for one of the 7-day missionary pilots, whose name was Bill Paslow, to fly them in a little plane over to Wabag. Now, they always used to joke that Bill Paslow, the pilot, had a really bad name for a pilot. Because if you're a pilot, you don't want to pass low over anything. You want to be up in the sky, but his name was Pilot Paslow. Pilot Paslow had the plane all ready for them the day they were going to travel by air over to Wabag, and they showed up at the mountain airstrip. Now, you need to understand what I mean by mountain airstrip. Most of Papua New Guinea is very mountainous, and these are not gentle sloping mountains that go up and up and up, and then eventually come down and down and down. These are mountains that look like this. Mountain up here and down here, and then another one here, and then another here, and then another one here, and then here, and there's just mountain peaks just everywhere. And then you have to fly through the valleys, or if the mountain's not too tall, fly over those mountains to get where you need to go. Now, the thing is, because it was so mountainous, a lot of the places that they would build the airstrips, the runway to be able to take off, had to be really short, and they often had to end in a drop-off, because they didn't have very many level places in these mountainous regions. So they would basically find the side of a mountain that wasn't super steep, like maybe only like this steep, and then they would work at it for days, and the people would volunteer to do this because the villagers would know in that area, hey, if we get an airstrip built, we'll be able to have people flying in planes. They can bring medicine to us. They can bring food to us. We'll be able to have emergency help. So this is good for us to have an airstrip. So they would work for days. They'd clear the trees on the side of this slope, and then they would try to level it out as much as they could. But these airstrips were not really smooth. If you've ever been in a plane, you know that the runway is usually really long and smooth, like a long piece of highway. Not there. It was dirt and all bumpy, and usually had little stumps still sticking out of the ground. And like I said, it usually ended in a drop-off because they didn't have a long piece of ground to work with, so they'd build it on the side of a mountain, and then at the end of the runway, it would just drop down, which meant that as long as the plane was going fast enough, if it was going along on the runway, it could just go and take off like that. It was always a little bit exciting and scary to be in a plane. As you took off, and instead of going up, you would start to go down first, and then you'd go up. But Bill Paslow had been doing this for a long time, and so he told them when they arrived that day, all right, let's see, we've got to make sure we have not too much weight on this plane. Let's see, we've got 3 pastors, you've got your belongings, we have all these extra boxes of supplies we wanted to take. Let me do some calculations on my fuel. So he did all the math, and he figured out how much fuel he'd put in the plane to carry this many people, how much that would weigh, how fast the wind was going. He did all these calculations, and he said, you know what, we can bring those boxes of supplies too. Now, Elwyn Martin was also a pilot. He wasn't as experienced as Bill Paslow, but he had done some flying in these bush planes. He said, I think maybe we should leave a couple boxes behind. And Bill said, no, we're going to be fine. It's fine. Let's put them on. So they got on, and then Bill said, all right, let's check and see what directions the wind is coming from again, because the wind would shift back and forth. And he checked, and now the wind was coming from the opposite direction. So they could take off in 2 directions on this airstrip. You could take off in one direction, which would have to kind of go up the airstrip a bit, and then it dropped off. Or you could take off in the other direction, going down the airstrip, and then it dropped off. He said the wind is coming from the uphill direction, and you want to take off into the wind, so the wind is pushing under your wings to lift you up. So he said that's the direction we'll take off. So they all got in, they all got buckled in. Bill Pazlo was up at the front, and the other three missionaries were sitting all strapped into the little seats and surrounded with all their boxes and belongings. There's not a lot of room in these planes. There's no like separate cargo compartment. You travel with your stuff sitting on your lap and all around you. And they got ready, and the engine was revving up. And Elwyn looked out the window at the windsock. You guys know what a windsock is? It's like it doesn't look necessarily like an actual sock, but it's like a long tube kind of shaped like a cone, and the wind blows through it. And so whichever way the windsock is pointing, that's the direction that the wind is coming from. Or the rain, apparently. So, they needed to take off. Help me remember. Did they need to take off into the wind or with the wind behind them? Into the wind. So, the windsock had been blowing this way as they were getting ready to line up. But Elwyn looked out the window, and he noticed the windsock was now pointing the other way. And he uh-oh. The wind's pointing in the wrong direction. It's pointing from behind us. And he began to try to get out of his seat to tell Bill Pazlo what was going on, and Bill Pazlo took off, and the engines roared, and he couldn't even hear Elwyn trying to call for him. And so as they were going, they were now going with the wind behind them, which sounds good at first, because, oh yeah, it's going to push you, right? But it's not pushing under the wings to lift them up. It was pushing them down from the back. And they were going on the uphill direction, and this all combined to mean that when they got to the edge of the drop-off, they dropped off. They did not start climbing. They just went steep dive down, and everybody was just hanging on. And Bill Pazlo yelled over his shoulder, "Hang on, everybody, hang on!" And he began pulling and fighting with the controls of the plane, trying to bring it out of this dive. And the plane began to level a little bit, but now they were so far down into this valley below them that the mountains were rising on either side, and there was a mountain up ahead as well. And they were down so low that some of the taller trees were whipping right past their wingtips, and Bill Pazlo was having to not only try to struggle and lift the plane up this way, but also juke it from side to side to avoid hitting the trees. And everybody in that plane was praying, just praying and praying. And the people who'd been up on the airstrip watching them take off, which included 2 doctors and a nurse, all that group up there saw what had happened. They all dropped to their knees and began praying as well. And they were flying faster and faster, picking up more speed, but they were going faster towards a mountain ahead of them. And even though Bill was pulling as hard as he could on the yoke, and the plane was starting to come up a bit, Bill called back over his shoulder, "Guys, buckle in, we're not going to make it." Those were the last words Bill Pazlo ever said. Bill Pazlo, in a moment of expert flying, realized they weren't going to make it over that cliff that was facing them right dead on, and he knew that if they were to hit straight into a cliff, it would just crumple them. It would probably explode them, and then they'd drop down the side of the cliff. So instead, what he did was he cut the engines. Why? Because he didn't want any fuel going into the engines, and then that could explode if a spark would happen. So he cut the engines off, and then he banked the plane over into a couple of tall trees that were right there to hit them in the tops, hoping that maybe the branches would catch the plane and not cause it to go slamming into a cliff or into the ground. And they hit into the trees so hard that everyone in the plane got knocked unconscious, except for Bill Pazlo, who was killed instantly. And the plane slid through the tree branches and then tumbled end over end and landed down on the ground. The first person to wake up inside the plane of the 3 people who remained was Pastor Grieve. Pastor Grieve woke up, and he had a broken arm, but even with his broken arm, he reached around and unclipped the belts on the other 2 people, Elwyn Martin and the other pastor. And then, because he could see fuel pouring out from the torn engine lines, he grabbed them and with one arm dragged them out away from the plane, hoping they would not explode. And the plane did not explode. And then he began hiking with his broken arm just held inside of his shirt, leaving the other 2 men there unconscious. And he began hiking back towards the airstrip. And after hiking for about a mile, he met the rescuers who had hiked already a couple miles down the hills and through the mountain passes to get to them. And these rescuers came, and they made little cots, little litters, and they loaded the 3 men on there and carried them out. Now, the other 2 pastors, besides Elwyn, they were injured. They had broken bones, and they were bruised and banged up, but they were conscious, and they were okay. Elwyn was fading in and out of consciousness. He kept kind of half waking up and then fading out, and waking up and fading out. And he also had a broken leg, and he had a broken hand. And every time that he would kind of wake up while they were carrying him those 3 miles back up to the airstrip, he would go, "Easy, boys, easy, Easy, easy. It was hurting him, and he was not understanding what was going on. And so all he was doing was complaining about the pain. And Pastor Martin said later on, he always felt bad that he hadn't realized how hard they were having to work, because they were having to carry these heavy men on these litters, climbing up these steep, muddy embankments, hanging onto tree branches, just fighting to get them back up to the airstrip in the hope they'd be able to get them help with another plane to get them to medical assistance. Now, they were up at the airstrip, 2 doctors and a nurse. And when they got the men up there, the 2 doctors and the nurse began working on the 3 men. And everybody knew Elwyn was the worst off of the 3. He was just still fading in and out of consciousness. Now he was barely staying conscious and just laying there. He looked real pale. He didn't look like he could make it through. He had blood all over him, and he just had wounds everywhere. And so Pastor Martin remembered hearing the nurse come over to him and say, "Doctor, you have to come and take a look at him. Dr. Willow, please come look at him because he doesn't look good." And Dr. Willow came over and said, "Oh boy, no, there's no hope for Elwyn. Elwyn's had it. Let's focus on the others." The nurse didn't give up. She ran over and got to the other doctor. "Dr. Yates, come over here, please. You've got to try to help. You've got to try to help." Dr. Yates got down next to Elwyn, and he shook him, and he opened his eyelids, held them open. And he said, "Elwyn, can you hear me?" And Elwyn said, "Yeah." He said, "How are you doing?" Elwyn said, "I'm finished." Because he had heard the other doctor already tell him that he was done for. "I'm finished. I'm finished." And Dr. Yates said, "Oh, come on, Elwyn. Pull your socks up. You'll be fine." And then he kept on working on him and helping him. And Elwyn thought to himself, well, if he says, "Pull your socks up, you'll be fine," I guess I won't give up quite yet. But there were painful days ahead. They flew Elwyn in an airplane, and it was a bumpy ride, and every single one of his broken bones hurt. They got him to a small clinic, and they were able to tend to some of his wounds, and then they flew him 2 days later, when he seemed a little more stable, to the Mount Hagen Hospital along the coastline, and there the doctors were able to take x-rays, and they found that he had multiple broken bones in his head. His skull was cracked in all these different places. And the doctors there said, "We don't understand how you're still alive this many days later. You broke so many bones and you had so much swelling of your brain that you should have just gone unconscious and never come back to consciousness." And Elwyn didn't know what to say. He could barely even talk. But after he'd been there at the hospital for about a week, Dr. Yates came to visit him to see how he was doing. And Dr. Yates came into the room and said, Elwyn, it's so good to see you, buddy. Oh, Elwyn, I can't believe you made it." And he began crying. Dr. Yates began crying. "I can't believe you made it." And Elwyn said, Wait a minute. You are the one who told me when I was lying there, you said, "Pull your socks up, you'll be okay." How come you said that if you didn't think I was going to make it? And Dr. Yates said, "Because I could tell you were ready to give up. If I had told you at that point that you were finished, you would have just quit. But I didn't want you to give up, Elwyn. I wanted you to try to fight. So I told you to pull your socks up." And Elwyn said, "If I could get out of this bed right now, I'd probably pop you in the nose." But Elwyn was always grateful that Dr. Yates had said just the right thing to keep him fighting. And Elwyn was even more grateful for all those people who had rescued him, and for the angels that must have protected him, and for the fact that God had work for him still to do. And you know, Elwyn Martin kept on working there in Papua New Guinea for a total of 42 years. Finally, he had gotten malaria so many times that he couldn't stay there working anymore. He'd gotten too weak from it, and he had to go back to Australia. And that's where he spent the rest of his life, there with his wife Alma. Haru Hariva, you want to know how his story turned out? Haru Hariva ended up having 12 children. He worked among the Turama River cannibals for most of his life. And then for the last 5 or 8 years of his life, when he was getting kind of physically weak, even though he was only in his 50s by this point, his body was starting to get weak, and he was developing some kind of problem with his heart. And he just kept on trying to push through. He worked with some of the established clinics, and he would go around giving advice on how to reach people that hadn't been reached yet. And finally, when he realized he'd gotten too sick to even go on anymore, he allowed himself to be taken to a hospital. And there, 9 of his 12 living children, they were all alive still at this point, 9 of his 12 children came to visit him there. And they were able to spend a few days with their dad. And during that time, they discovered something interesting. They all knew that their dad had been able to speak quite a few languages. He had learned he had been able to pick up dialects pretty quickly, just like his daughter Zita had been able to learn languages quickly. But when he was there in his last hours, in the last day or so, as he was starting to kind of go in and out of consciousness, he would start to talk in different dialects when he would wake up. He would talk in one dialect here, and then he'd go to sleep, and he'd wake up and he'd start talking in a different dialect. And his oldest son began keeping track of how many different languages and dialects Haru was speaking in, and not just speaking in little phrases, and he could speak fluently in them. Anybody want to make a guess to how many languages and dialects Haru could speak? 12. It was more than that. How many? Not 50, no. Less than 50, more than 12. 20. It was 32. 32 languages and dialects that he had learned to speak. God had given him that Holy Spirit power of learning languages, knowing that Haru would be going to so many people who just lived all by themselves off in the jungle and spoke their own little language, and he could pick it up so fast and be able to share the story of God with them. And Haru died from his heart condition. He was buried there in Papua New Guinea at the age of 55. His wife Kaura continued to live there until she was 83. Helping with all her grandchildren, her great-grandchildren, and every single one of Haru's children went on to become some kind of missionary. Some became nurses, some became doctors, some became pilots, some became sea captains, some became teachers, some became leaders in the church, in the 7 days conferences, and even one of them ended up becoming, for a while, the president of the Papua New Guinea conference. That was the influence of Haru's life on his own family, and all the people that he reached, and all the people that they reached. Can you guys imagine what it's going to be like someday in heaven? When Haru Hariva is standing there, and there's a line of people waiting to say hello to him, people that learned about Jesus from Haru, that line is going to be forever long. Elwyn's going to have a long line too. Guys, I am so glad that you were listening to these stories this week, but I want you to not just take away from these stories the exciting parts and the cliffhangers, which, even though you guys complain, I know you really like them. I hope that you won't only just remember those, but that you'll remember the bigger lesson, which is that even someone like Haru, who grew up in a poor little village, his mother died when he was little, his father would beat him regularly, he grew up being told, you can never go and learn about Jesus, and he was poor for the majority of his life, who lived in little simple ways out of the jungle just with other people helping to spread the news of Jesus. I want you guys to know that it doesn't matter how little you are right now, how rich or poor you are, how nice your family is. It doesn't matter how smart you are. It doesn't matter how privileged you are. God will use you if you let him. All you have to do is stand on the promises. All you have to do is trust that God, who says, fear not, I am with you. I have called you by your name. You are mine. That is the God who is going to walk with you through the fire, and he will not let the water overflow you. And he will use each one of you to reach someone else for Jesus. How many kids here would like to reach at least one other person for Jesus in their life? Raise your hand if you would like to at least reach one other person for Jesus in your life. God bless each one of you. Can we have a quick prayer? Heavenly Father, thank you that just like you used Haru and Elwyn, Amoa, Koivi, Zita, Midge, and all the other people we heard about during the stories this week, that you can use each one of these young people here, and that you will bring them to heaven someday to meet all the people that they've had an influence on, so that they can also see just how wonderful it is to serve you and tell others about you. Help us all, Lord, to go from this place remembering that that's what you've called us to do, and we can stand on the promises that you will walk with us all the way. We love you. Amen.